Welcome to 78.4, the podcast that helps you leave a godly legacy for future generations by showing you incredible things God has done in the lives of men and women around the world. If He can do those things in these people's lives, imagine what He can do in yours. I'm Bob.
And I'm Matt. So, Bob, anything interesting happened in the world since we've been gone?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, just a little bit.
Just a little bit. Now, as for us, we're still hauled up in our homes, recording this remotely from our separate abodes. And for some reason, I have vowed not to cut my hair until the vaccine is out. So
You're kidding.
It's getting unruly, Bob.
We've been in this for like 7 months. I
can go from forehead to chin at this point. It's getting bad. But besides the chaos of my hair, since we last spoke with all of you guys out there, there's been hurricanes, civil unrest, a divisive election, and a still surging virus entering its 10th month in the U.S. Things are piling and seem pretty insurmountable. And yet, God, right? What can we expect of God in times like these? Our contention is the only thing that can stop seemingly unstoppable forces is the actual unstoppable force, the God and creator of the universe.
Very true.
And so today, as we did all last season, we will hear from 3 people who have personally witnessed how unstoppable God really is. So, Bob, who's up first?
All right, Matt. Out of the hundreds of stories that you and I have worked on together, this one is one of my all-time favorites. And the guy who tells the story is just such a great storyteller.
Right.
But before we jump into it, it may help if I give you a little context.
Right.
Enver Hoxha was the prime minister of Albania from pretty much the end of World War II until his death in 1985. And this guy was nuts. He was nuts. He was so sold out to communism that even the Soviet Union and communist China were not communist enough for him. Within a year of him seizing power, he started shutting down churches and mosques, imprisoning Christians, and even executing priests. He even went so far as to have the crosses scraped off of the tombstones just to get rid of any memory of religion in the country at all. By the time Enver Hoxha died, Albania was totally isolated from the rest of the world. And the leaders after him tried to keep his policies going, but by that time, communism around the world had pretty much fallen, and that's the context into which our first guest, Don Mansfield, walked into.
I'd like to tell you about the Albanian Beach Boys. We had plans for nearly every country in Eastern Europe, but none for Albania. I mean, nobody had plans for Albania. It was the most closed country on the planet, along with North Korea and Mongolia. Those were the big 3 that missiologists, the people that study missions, always talked about being so tight, so constricted. This is the only country in the world where it was officially and legally required that you be an atheist if you were a citizen. And if anything else, you went to prison or you were executed. I remember we were standing on the island of Corfu looking across, the 6 kilometers to Albania thinking there's no way anything can happen there. This is like a prison for 4.5 million people. And someone did have a plan. In 1985, Operation Mobilization, they were going to take these either New Testament or Gospel marks, they were going to put them in the Ziploc bags, they were going to blow them up with air, then at the right time, they would throw them in the water and hope they would float into shore. Now, can you imagine a corporation having that as a sales plan? They'd fire the guy. Came up with that idea. And that's what Albania was like. So in 1991, all of a sudden, the Jesus Film office gets a phone call from a guy and said, hey, we would like to talk about having a Jesus film premiere. Now, the Jesus film is the story of the life of Jesus out of the Gospel of Luke, and this was a year and a half after the Berlin Wall fell. And so we went in August of 1991. They said, oh, we will take you to Durres. It's a very nice beach there. And we walked out on the beach. And I looked like Joe Tourist. I had the camera and I had my jeans on and everything. And as we went towards the beach, past the hotel, it's like everybody who looked at us, it was like this major parting of the water, because prior to that, any unauthorized contact with a foreigner was 5 years in prison. And so literally, it was like the water parted in front of us. People just moved out of the way because they're so afraid to even be near us. But as we were there, we looked down to the left, and here were these three guys. And these are like the kings of the beach. And you just look at them, you go, they're not here to look at the girls. They're here so the girls can look at them. Girls, take a look. That type of attitude. And as they were coming closer, I said to them, they're not going to be afraid to talk to us. They were really into it with themselves. And all of a sudden they looked up, and this one guy, who we found out later, his name is Leonard, I said, hey, you're from the West. What do you do for your life? And I said, I have the most amazing job on the planet. And I said, I get to go around and I get to tell people how they can know Jesus Christ personally, which gives them a relationship with God. And this flip attitude, like all of a sudden he says, he turns to the guys, he says, wasn't it 5 minutes ago we were talking, we said, we've got to find someone to tell us about Jesus. And he looked right at me, he says, will you tell me about Jesus? And for the next 45 minutes, we shared Christ with them, how they could know him. They're seeking God. They want to find out about Jesus. And I just happened to be there. I don't think that's a coincidence. I really don't. So fast forward to December, we came for the Jesus film premiere at the Palace of Congress. This is where the Communist Party laws were passed that resulted in the deaths of so many Christians in the country. And as people watched the Jesus film, we literally had 2,200 people in there. And as they started, people were just weeping. And as we looked out of the building, there was literally thousands of people waiting to get in. And as we were standing at the back of the auditorium, I looked down at the stage, and all of a sudden from backstage, these two guys in army fatigues come out. And all of a sudden, they look up at me, and I'm looking down at them, and they go, Don! They kind of start running up the aisle. Boom! Hug me. And it's Leonard. And they said, we debated it for a month, but we've all received Christ. We've asked Jesus into our life. Incredible. And I said, wait a minute, before we say anything, let me just ask you something. I said, that August when I was with you and we shared about Jesus, is that the first time you ever heard anything about the Lord? He says, well, yes and no. And I said, no? He says, about 5 years ago, he says, it was really, and he kind of looked around. It was kind of interesting. He says, I live in Durres, and I work for the Coast Guard. And one day, it was 5 or 6 years ago, he says, all of a sudden, there's this thing on the beach. And I went over and I picked it up. And I opened it, and he says, and there was a book inside. And I go, wait a minute, was it a New Testament or Gospel of Mark? He goes, how do you know? I said, I know the guys that did that. I said, what did you do? He said, I had to decide right then if I was willing to risk 5 years in prison and keep the book or just throw it away. I said, you kept it, didn't you? And he said, yes. But I've never told anybody until tonight. God will move heaven and earth to bring his word to anyone who wants it, even in the most closed country on the planet. I'm absolutely convinced there is no such thing as heathen will never hear. If your heart wants to know, God will do it for you. Do you really want to know?
God will move heaven and earth. That is such a great story, and it shows that no matter how impossible you may think a situation is, there's nothing that could stop God.
I also love how he uses seemingly just plain bad human strategy. Like chuck Bibles into the water and hope. Yet God can take an impossible situation like in Albania and reach and save anyone who desires to know him. Which brings us to our next story from Esther Cowen. What can God do when, like in Russia in the early 90s, when all the power of the government is threatening your livelihood? How can God protect you against something you can't possibly fight on your own?
Being a missionary kid and being involved in international, my heart just kind of wanted to get to more of the world. And I moved to Moscow. So we were doing this training with this particular group of teachers down in Rostov-na-Don, which is down in southern part of Russia. And we would teach them new teaching techniques, but we gave them also spiritual help. And the lectures were on the historicity of the Bible, the historical proof for the resurrection, who Jesus was. We brought in walk through the Bible people to teach them how to use the Bible. Most of them had never ever had a Bible and didn't think it was even possible to have a Bible. So one of the most joyous things we, as the visiting American team, got to do was give these teachers a Bible. Each one, we'd just go and hand it to them. And they would grab it, tears coming down their face. And one lady said, I thought only priests could have Bibles. I didn't know I could have a Bible. Because many of the cities that we went to, there was no churches, no missions organization, the Orthodox Church was there, but there was very little else in way of spiritual. I remember one teacher who was telling us about her experience. There's parts of Russia were very open to what we were doing, and other parts were not open at all. And this teacher was telling about how she'd gone back from the conference and she was teaching the curriculum in her class, and the kids were loving it. And they were loving her, and they were learning, and they were changing in their behavior and everything. And the principal came to her and he said, you can't teach that in the school anymore. I've been told by the officials that you can't teach that in the school anymore. And so you have to stop. And she says, I can't. She said, I've learned this. It's made a difference in my life. I see my pupils. They're changing. They're being kinder to each other. They're telling the truth. She said, I have to keep teaching it. And he said, well, you can't. And so they were sort of at a standoff. And she just kept teaching it, and he fired her. And she said, as she went and met with him for the final time, she said, well, if I leave this school, God is going to leave this school too. And he just kind of didn't know what to do with that, and she left. In the next 2 weeks, the plumbing went bad, the electricity, students had severe accidents, there was fighting in the faculty, and just one thing after another went wrong. And after the 3rd week of her being gone, the principal came back and said, we want you to come back and teach at the school, and you can teach whatever you want to. And so she came back, and she was able to just pick right up where she was, teaching the curriculum to the students, showing the Jesus film in the classroom, and many of her pupils trusted Christ. And she had an influence in the teachers' lives too. And God, again, just was gonna, this principal thought he was in control, but he had nothing compared to what God was gonna do. I had heard a talk that Alistair Begg gave, and the title of it was Inadequacy, the Surprising Secret to Being Useful to God. And I thought, that's how I feel, Lord. We are so inadequate. We are up against this machine of a government that loves to throw things, barriers in on the road, loves to make things difficult. Rarely did we go with plan A. We had to have plan B, C, or D in effect. And we would have our backs up against the wall, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing we could do to change the officials' minds or to get the visas issued on time or any number of things. And God came through. He just did. And it was such an exhilarating feeling, you know, when your back's against the wall, God has got to do it. I've never, ever had him not come through.
God's got your back. You just keep following God and know that if he lives in you, then wherever you go, he is. You literally have despair and death's kryptonite with you at all times. And he's bigger than any government, any threat, any problem. God is with you standing strong. So whenever I hear stories like that, and whenever I'm personally worried, and boy, have I had a rocky 8 months here. Maybe one of these days I'll go into some of it with you all. But the comfort and peace I find knowing that God is right here in my pain, in the not understanding everything that's happening, that he knows full well what's going on, that he loves me, he's got my back. It makes all the difference.
Just one of the things I noticed in Esther's story is that knowing that she was with God and God was with her gave her the courage to stand up to and almost even dare bad things to happen to her.
Right.
And that sounds odd, but it's like when you're on God's side, you don't have to be afraid of anything, not even losing your job or whatever, because God's got it all in control. That teacher had incredible trust. And
Yeah,
I'm
she
just really...
didn't have, it wasn't like she was hoping God would be there. It's like she knew what God was going to do.
Exactly.
Which brings us to our last guest of the show.
Our last guest is Steve Douglas. He's currently the host of the radio program Making Your Life Count, and we'll add a link to that in our show notes. And he just stepped down as being president of Campus Crusade for Christ International. He served for 19 years. Now, before Steve, Campus Crusade's president was its founder, Bill Bright. Bill and Steve were very close friends. In fact, Bill even officiated at Steve's wedding. And Bill was a visionary. There was nothing that was going to get in the way of the world hearing the gospel as far as he was concerned. Steve is very, very smart, and he's very practical. And Bill needed him because it was Steve's job to figure out ways around those obstacles. Let's listen to Steve talk about what he learned from Bill about faith and what he learned about God.
One of my very favorite phrases that I would hear from Bill Bright often was the following: face it, that's not far-fetched. Now, where I came from, you didn't use the term far-fetched, but I knew what he meant. And he always reserved that phrase for when it really was far-fetched. Whatever it was he was talking about wasn't going to happen very easily, and certainly not without the power of God. And one of the circumstances where he used it with me anyway was when he started talking about this student congress that he thought we ought to have. I think it was the fall of 1969. He went to I believe it was a Graham crusade in Minneapolis, and he sat next to somebody. He got to talking about doing something that would be big with students. And he came back and talked to me and others about it. And several of us had the obvious statement, you know, that's a pretty big endeavor for us. And he would say, well, face it, that's not far-fetched. It was far-fetched. But you know what happened? That Congress was called Explo 72. Had 85,000 people actually show up in the main training part, and well over 150,000 at the last event out in an open air area. God used Bill Bright as a man of faith. When a biography was written of Bill Bright, it was called Amazing Faith. That really was part of what he was all about. He walked with the Lord humbly, but he also walked in great faith that God would do amazing things. And he did. And my lesson personally is I need to walk in that faith. Every day I face situations where I'm either going to trust God or I'm going to operate in what I can explain. Now, I think God does ask us to use our heads and to a lot of times make decisions that just make sense. But sometimes I have this sense that God wants me to step out in significant faith. And I would believe that would be true of any of us. We don't want to pass those by because some of the greatest blessings are when we step out in faith. I'm going to give you an illustration of that. I had the opportunity to speak to a large leadership breakfast at Kansas State University. This was back in the 1980s. And I couldn't actually share the gospel. That was the limitation. I could, though, share my testimony. So I did that. I took advantage of what I could. And I was teaching a seminar on time management to these leaders, 600 leaders, and several faculty, and actually the football coach was there. And after I got done, I felt kind of frustrated because I didn't really have a chance to tell them what was most important. And the football coach came up to me and he said, I sure wish the team could have been here to hear what you had to say. So after he left, I talked to our staff and I said, I could be wrong, but I think I got an invitation to speak to the football team tonight if we want. And so we contacted the coach and he said, sure, I'd love to have you come over and share. And I said, well, I shared for an hour. You probably don't have that kind of time. What part of what I shared would you like me to talk to the team about? And he said, oh, that part where you talked about peace. Well, that was my testimony. He wanted me to share my testimony with the team. So I came in to the session there with the team. They were all suited up and everything for their last practice before the game the next day. And I was all excited about sharing, particularly because this team hadn't been doing well this year. They were 0-6. And they were playing Iowa State University the next day, and they were ranked number 11 in the nation at that point. So, this didn't look too good for them. And experiencing peace would be probably something they could afford to have a little greater measure of. Well, as I began to share my testimony, it seemed to me like these guys weren't very interested. When is this going to be over? What will the coach think of next? We're 0-6. He's getting desperate. That's what I felt, anyway. And here's an interesting thing. Later, 12 of those athletes came to Christ as our staff members met with him. But that's not really the point of my story. I was wrong, in other words, in my assessment of where they were. But the point of my story is what happened as I was speaking. I had this strange experience. I've only had it a few times where I was speaking and saying something, and God was telling me to say something different. Well, I'm speaking to the group. I already told you it was running kind of poorly. Yeah, I thought anyway. And I hear God saying I should say something different. And I'm having this discussion with God off to the side mentally, and I'm trying to talk to the group. That's very difficult to do. And I remember saying to God, no, I can't say that. Oh, no, I couldn't say that. This was my reaction to what God was saying. And finally, I just capitulated, and I said, okay, God, this is against my better judgment, but I will just step out in faith and do what you said for me to say. So here's what I said. Well, men, I don't know how many of you believe in prayer, but I do. And tomorrow, when you play Iowa State University, number 11th ranked team in the nation, I'm going to pray that you win. That's what God told me to say. Now, you don't ever say that, do you? You just don't want to get into that arena. Well, the staff at the back of the room, of course, didn't have the benefit of this conversation with God, and they all just about passed out. Oh, no, we've ruined our ministry. There's no way they're going to win. Well, I left town the next day for obvious reasons, and as I was on the airplane, it was about the time of the game, and I wrote a note to the coach. I figured I was already in this up to my neck, and I wrote a note to the coach and said, well, I just want you to know, I realize you're playing the game, and I'm praying still that you will win. Dropped it in the mail at O'Hare Field, and I took the bus out to Rockford, Illinois, my hometown. Well, I turned on the sports that night with great interest. Big upset of the day. Kansas State beats Iowa State. Even God couldn't do that. Was my level of faith probably, but he did it. That wasn't the biggest part of it, though. I got a call from the director at Kansas State a couple days later. He said, you're not going to believe it. I said, I know, they won. It was incredible. He said, oh, no, it's much bigger than that. I said, what could be bigger than that? He said, let me read to you from the front page of the sports section of the Manhattan newspaper. Douglas, my name, parentheses, who? Key to Kansas State win. Apparently, they'd interviewed him and said, how did this happen? And he was racking his brain for what he did differently. It wasn't the new offense or new defense. He said, well, I brought this motivational speaker in to share a little bit. And so the big question was, so what did he share? On campus for the next couple of weeks, what did he share? You talk about being open to the gospel spreading. Our staff had a heyday being able to say, well, I'll tell you what he said and talk about God. See, we need to step out in faith. It was very tempting not to do that in that circumstance. And I suspect you would have that same experience a lot of times where it seems like God's saying to do such and such. If he says it, you better do it. And very likely there's a great blessing right around the corner.
There are two things in each of these stories that stand out to me. The first is nothing can stop God. It doesn't matter if it's a hostile government or some power-crazed bureaucrat or one of the best teams in the country. God will do what he intends to do. And absolutely nothing in heaven or earth or below earth can stop him.
Right.
The next thing is we've got to step out in faith. Don went into Albania without a plan, just trusting God to open doors. Esther's friend lost her job, but she still wouldn't back down. And Steve, even though it went against his better judgment, he trusted God and did what God was telling him to do. Esther said it so well when she said, "It's such an exhilarating feeling. When your back's against the wall, God has got to do it. And I've never, ever had him not come through."
And when I hear these stories, I'm actually reminded of one of my other favorite legacy stories that we've ever done, where
All right.
they're looking outside the window at heavy rain, frightening thunder, dark clouds everywhere they look, and yet someone reminded them, it may look bad to us, but don't you know, the sun shines above those clouds. God
Absolutely.
shines and reigns over every dark thing we see in front of us now, and there's a lot right now. And that's an incredibly hopeful and encouraging truth, that God is more powerful than any obstacle, that God is unstoppable. So that ends our first episode of season 2 today. And our hope is that everyone listening, going through all these dark things in our country, or the myriad of personal issues you might have, isn't it good to know that God is shining above it all and will be there to get us through anything that comes our way?
Our hope with 78.4 is that it'll help you flourish in your relationship with Jesus. That's why we include the links to articles and tools in our show notes as a way of helping you grow in Him and becoming a difference in someone else's life. So please check out our show notes. Also, please email us. We'd love to get to know you and know how we can minister to you.
The audio you heard today comes from some of the more than 400 and nearing 500 and growing videos on our website, legacy.cru.org. That's legacy.cru.org. We also have a YouTube channel, Cru Legacy, and a Facebook page, so please check it out. And if you like today's podcast, we ask that you please subscribe so you can get the next one and the next one and the next. Also, please rate us. It helps others hear about our podcast.
78.4 is a podcast of Legacy, a project of Cru.
Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week. And while we're away, we want to encourage you to remember that whatever God did in the lives of the people you heard speak today, He can do in you. So until we are together again, go out there and continue the legacy.